Hi there. We are going to be talking about the history of vampires or vampirism. Origin. This appears to have originated, as far as we can tell, in ancient Greece. We do have episodes in ancient Egypt, such as blood transfusion in some of the mythologies of the gods. Of the Egyptian gods, but it's very different. Obviously, it's very different than drinking blood and the consumption of that. So, the Greek goddess of the dead and of witchcraft, Hecate, while it wasn't normal for people to worship her in evil ways, since she was the goddess of the dead, people could worship her in normal ways or pay their respects in normal ways. There are going to be some insidious individuals who consider her the goddess of witchcraft, and they are going to worship her as such. When we talk about witchcraft, I'm referring to maleficium, evil magic, insidious, nasty things, typically involving necromancy, and sometimes the ritual is known as the kriya, or the eating of someone's corpse. It's not very nice stuff we're talking about here, and specifically also curses. Right. Hecate, the witch would typically use Hecate to do harm unto someone else. And this way, Hecate is what we think of as a demon. Do harm or to someone else and typically be eating them, right? So if I wanted to be avenged or I didn't like someone, I could theoretically send Hecate after them. One of the creatures or demons of Hecate was the Empusa, right? It's very similar to Lamia in that it's a devouring female demonic-like creature that hunts people and then eats them, right? And sometimes it's luring men to their deaths via sexual flirtation, and then the consumption of them, typically involving eating them outright or drinking their blood. Right, and so it's really the first time that we see that in history, the idea of the blood sucker, right, the blood drinker. There isn't much evidence of this, but there are mystery cults. There were mystery cults devoted to Hecate, and due to the fact that there is then the kriya ritual, which involves consumption of dead flesh, it is not unlikely that there was also blood drinking involved of corpses in this mystery cult surrounding Hecate. Interestingly, another factor into that is that in ancient Greece, it was believed that the consumption of blood, the drinking of someone's blood, granted them some sort of power or often to restore youth or energy. Now, it's very important to understand that Greeks did not like this kind of stuff, right? These are insane individuals living in Greece, just like we have them here. These are people within Greece that the Greeks do not like. They don't like this kind of thing. They don't like necromancy. They don't like they don't like cannibalism. They really don't like human sacrifice. They don't like any of this stuff. So it's important to specify that when I'm talking about these instances occurring in ancient Greece or these people living in ancient Greece. We're not talking about what we think of as a normal Greek, right? The Greek writer Apollonius writes that he witnessed an Empusa or a Lamia preying on a philosophy student. This Empusa confessed to him it was fattening up the student she targeted to feed on him, and that she especially craved young men for the freshness and purity of their blood, right? So we see here the Empusa is indeed after the blood of this young man because it contains some property that is, I don't know, either nourishing or gratifying or somehow magically relevant. Pliny the Elder, right, and we have another instance of describing some oddness here, which I don't know that this is true. In fact, I doubt it's true. He's going to describe in Rome in around 50 AD a mad rush of spectators into arenas to drink the blood of fallen gladiators. Now, This seems outlandish. I think he's more mocking the barbarity of the gladiator arena itself, these games themselves. Vampirism or blood drinking is currently occurring in the same time in the deep BC era in the Middle East. In Leviticus 17, the Bible commands, "If any native Israelite or foreigner living among you eats or drinks blood in any form, I will turn against that person and cut him off from the community of your people." The need to issue such a commandment suggests that instance of blood drinking indeed had either occurred in the Middle East that were known about or were occurring. Interestingly, in the Middle Ages, we're getting to that now, Marsilio Ficino in the 1400s is a medical doctor who's going to promote the drinking of young people's blood as a means for the elderly to regain their youthful vigor. Right? When we think of the classic vampire that we think of today, we're thinking about, they have eternal life. How do they get this eternal life? Well, apparently, it's very much linked to the drinking of blood. This idea goes back thousands of years that drinking blood can somehow restore one's youth or make someone younger or live longer. In the Middle Ages, let's see, how did one become a vampire? Okay, a person who died of a disease could return from the grave to infect family members with the disease they died of. A vampire was not a Twilight or even Count Dracula type thing. It was a zombie, more or less. I want you to think of a zombie or The Walking Dead, except they're not trying to eat your brains, they're wanting to suck your blood. Okay, so just imagine a rotten corpse rising from the grave to eat you, all right, or to suck your blood, drink your blood. Okay, but yeah, a person who died of disease could return. They thought in the Middle Ages could return from the grave to infect family members with the disease they died of. So you do see places in Eastern Europe and even in Britain where they will shove a brick down a supposed vampire's throat, the corpse, and really tie that corpse down and make sure it doesn't get out to rise from the dead. There are instances in a village in England, actually, where they believe there was an undead apocalypse happening, and they all fled the town to get away from it for fear of vampires. In Romanian belief, it took 40 days for the soul of the deceased to enter paradise. In some cases, it was thought that the soul could linger for years, which is common in Judaism. I believe the belief was 2 years. The soul would linger in a restless state before it would eventually go on to the great beyond. But in this belief, the Romanian belief, there were a myriad of ways that a deceased family member could turn into a vampire during the soul's lingering. It was thought that, another superstitious belief, that dying unmarried, unforgiven by one's parents, through suicide or being murdered, were all ways someone could return as a vampire. Even after death, breezes blowing across corpses before burial, dogs or cats walking over a coffin, or leaving a mirror not turned to the wall at this time, it could all turn someone into a vampire. So we have that happening. There's not unlike with werewolves and witches and other things. There's not cases of really vampire trials that are available, and there's just not evidence of vampire trial. We're not seeing that. The church is not going around hunting vampires. This is secular. This is something peasants are doing, right? And so there's not much documentation of it. But also that's helped by the fact that in their belief, a vampire was someone who was already dead, right? So you're not going to get real instances of people blood-sucking other people being attributed to a vampire because, quite frankly, they didn't see it that way, right? We are going to get into real vampires now. When I talk about real vampires, I mean there are real people out there who have in the past, and they're still around today, who do hunt humans to kill them and then drink their blood afterwards, right? And so, and that way, vampires are real, right? We're going to talk about some of these more famous cases, and this is going to be in the modern era where we're going to see them, and we can pretty reasonably ascertain that these types of individuals, these blood drinkers, were around in ancient times and in medieval times as well. In fact, that's pretty much a guarantee. If they're around now, they're definitely around back then. The first one is, and I'm not going to be naming a lot of these names, specifically because, a lot of these serial killers really like, popularity, and we're not going to do anything like that to give rise to their popularity or their name. The Vampire of Dusseldorf was a German vampire in the 1920s who preyed on children. He would kill the victim and then drink their blood, which he stated caused him great sexual arousal. He also apparently drank the blood of a swan, and with his last victim, he drank so much blood that he vomited. He apparently had a sexual perversion involving blood that fueled his desire to drink blood. He was sentenced to death by guillotine, and just before his head was placed on the guillotine, the individual told the psychiatrist, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." So this guy was very insane, very sadistic, very into blood, obviously. There's going to be another vampire in Germany, unsurprisingly, right? It's another German man. His name is the Vampire of Hanover. He primarily killed and drank the blood of children. In total, he killed around 27 people. He was executed by guillotine in 1925. The Vampire of Sacramento. What? In the U.S.? No. We're not going to mention his real name either. In the 1970s, this man was institutionalized after being determined to be dangerously insane. While at the institution, he caught and snapped the necks of 2 birds and then drank their blood. That's a red flag. He also caught a rabbit and tried to inject the rabbit's blood directly into his own veins. That's another red flag. Despite this, after some medication, they cleared him of being not dangerous to the public and released him upon the world, wherein he went on to kill at least 6 people, rape and drank their blood, and then raped their corpses. Yeah, probably shouldn't have been released. He was given the death penalty but committed suicide in prison. Apparently the prisoners were afraid of him and encouraged him to commit suicide because they were so terrified of him. 1980. An individual who had for years been drinking the blood of animals would escalate and kill his grandmother and drink her blood. When he was arrested, he claimed to be a 700-year-old vampire and that he needed to drink the blood of his elder in order to survive, and that the drinking of the blood would make him youthful again. See, the youthful thing. Sentenced to life in prison. 1996, a person who went by the alter ego Visago started a vampire cult, in which the members of the cult would willingly drink each other's blood. This is actually still happens today. There are these weird little cults going on. This eventually escalated, and Visago would kill his parents, what we call matricide or patricide. It's usually in a satanic rite. Again, not affiliated with Satanism, but actual devil worship. Visago would kill his parents and drink their blood and subsequently be sentenced to life in prison. I think this should give everyone a fairly adequate understanding that blood drinkers and those that kill in order to drink the blood of their victims do unfortunately exist, right, in the real world. Such individuals undoubtedly, right, spurred the creation of the vampire myth and, through their abominable actions. I I wish this is not the case, but yes, there are still vampire cults out there who do drink their own blood consensually, and so that is real. And Hecate again plays a role in this, due to people wanting to revisit the past and resurrect old things, and obviously misinterpret them in terrible ways. But yes, Hecate, goddess of witchcraft, they consider her their patron. Many of these blood drinkers will be pretty into her as well, modern day ones. So if you don't believe me, Google it. Google Hecate blood cult ritual. You'll find a lot of stuff. I do want to say this while we're talking about this. If you are an individual who, holds the belief that you are in fact a vampire, or are engaging in blood drinking, or do have a sexual attraction to blood, you should seek professional psychological help, right? And such mental disorders and beliefs have a way of escalating, and you should definitely seek help if you are suffering from such proclivities. All right. So we get into the 1870s. Before that, before the discovery of germs, there is a superstition lingering in Europe that about the way disease is being spread. One of these ways, as we touched on a little bit earlier, is the vampire, an individual who can resurrect from the grave and spread the disease to family members and friends, right? At the time, it wasn't really understanding how germs propagated, right? Or that was, and so one such explanation was that, my Uncle Gary died of tuberculosis 3 weeks ago. Now all of a sudden I have tuberculosis and my wife has it. It's Gary back from the dead infecting us, right? That was the idea of the vampire for many centuries in Western Europe. Now in the Greek world, not just in the Greek world, the Eastern European world, you do still see the myths of the bloodsuckers, right? The Impusa and the Lamia, referred to as Gela. So the idea of the actual blood-sucking vampire still carries on in the East and eventually makes its way west. That's going to occur with really the Eastern understanding of vampires is going to be popularized by the novel Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula. And it's going to occur in the 1870s. And this is also the time where germs end, right? Where germs are discovered. So such superstitions about vampires being zombies, rise of the great, infecting people with disease, they're going to realize that's wrong, right? And so Bram Stoker is going to come in right on time with Dracula, which is going to change the notion of what the vampire is to Western Europeans, which is ultimately what it's always been in the Eastern world, and starting from the Greeks to the bloodsucker. Now, various mythologies, if you have any interest in this sort of stuff, it's the idea of the individual sleeping in a coffin, rising at night, going out, sucking blood. They have eternal life. They're very difficult to injure. A wooden stake, have to be killed in the heart with a wooden stake. Aversion to silver, just like the werewolf or any undead. That idea comes from any undead has an aversion to silver in medieval lore. So that in a nutshell is the history of the vampire. It's not a very long one, and I can't really help that. There's only so much mentioned about it in ancient texts, going back to ancient Greece, where we see real vampirism, and the idea of real bloodsuckers is there in ancient Greece. But when we get to the Middle Ages, you're not seeing that many stories of it. You're finding is corpses that had been that had been, you know, treated in such a way that they would not be able to rise again as these zombie-like vampires, or what all they were called vampires. They were really spreaders of disease, zombies that spread disease. So there's a long section of where, although people are interested in vampires, they're not really writing that much about them, right? And although, you know, people, while they're still alive, due to the Western European understanding of what a vampire is, which is a dead person that comes back, you're not going to see things like a witch trial or a werewolf trial, and where you're going to put a living person on trial for such a thing, because frankly, it has to be a dead person in order to be a vampire. So they're going to get trialed as probably a werewolf, due to the fact that if you're drinking blood, you're also committing an act of cannibalism, which would associate you with a werewolf, right? So I hope this did enlighten some of you who watched this video and learned something about the history of vampires and bloodsuckers. And yeah, stay tuned for our next video. Thanks again for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them on the YouTube.